Yeah, I did change, and I'm really glad I changed.
This one's wife. I tried to stop them. Or did I? Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. An interesting story has appeared in the British press relating to something that purportedly took place some time ago, and it throws up some interesting questions that help you understand more about the way that a narcissist would behave, and also the way that an individual who's under the influence of a narcissist would behave. As reported in the Telegraph, Boris Johnson, for it is he, yes, good old Bojo, tried to persuade Prince Harry not to leave the United Kingdom with his wife, this one's wife, the former Prime Minister has revealed. Mr. Johnson said he was asked to give the Duke of Sussex a manly pep talk to convince him not to step back from his royal duties. Officials from Buckingham Palace and Downing Street are said to have believed the last-minute intervention in January 2020 could have succeeded in talking Harry out of his decision. However, despite his efforts, the Duke left for Canada the next day to be reunited with his wife and his son Archie, triggering a rift with the rest of the royal family. Mr. Johnson said there was a ridiculous business when they made me try to persuade Harry to stay. Kind of manly pep talk, totally hopeless. Now you might wonder, why is Boris Johnson telling us this now? Why is he referencing an event from a few years ago? Well, here's your answer. The disclosure comes in his memoir, Unleashed, which is to be published on October the 10th. Accordingly, in order to drum up interest in his memoir, it's been decided to make reference to a interaction that took place between him and Prince Harry a few years ago because, of course, Prince Harry is someone that people still remain interested in, and to reveal what probably was a detail that hitherto hadn't been revealed to many people may prove to be interesting and want people to take an interest in his memoir. As ever with Boris Johnson, it's entirely self-serving. Mr. Johnson writes that just weeks after his landslide election win, officials in both Downing Street and Buckingham Palace told him they believed he might be able to talk the prince out of his decision to walk away from his royal duties. The meeting is known to have taken place on January the 20th, 2020, during a UK-Africa Investment Summit in London's Docklands, and was one of the Duke's final appearances as a working member of the royal family. At the time, it was reported that the Duke and Mr. Johnson had an informal catch-up, chat, behind closed doors. The night before, the Duke had delivered a speech in front of guests at an evening event for Centre Barley, his charity based in Lesotho. In it, he had claimed he had no other option but to step back from royal life, and spoke of his sadness that it had come to this. The two men met for 20 minutes, without aids, as Mr. Johnson tried to persuade the prince to reconsider. A friend told the Daily Mail, which is serialising the book, that Mr. Johnson praised Harry's efforts with the Invictus Games, as well as the Duchess's work promoting the education of women and girls in developing countries, a passion of the former Prime Minister. He thought they were a great asset to UK PLC, and it was a real shame they were leaving when they were doing such great work, the friend said. It was a man-to-man conversation. They were totally alone. But Harry was not for turning. He was unpersuadable by that point. Boris succeeded in delivering Brexit, but even he couldn't stop Megxit. A week earlier, on January the 13th, Prince Harry joined his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, father and elder brother for what has become known as the Sandringham Summit, in which they attempted to discuss the Duke and Duchess of Sussex's transition out of royal life. Then, the Queen released a statement affirming, "My family and I are entirely supportive of Harry and this one's wife's desire to create a new life as a young family. Although we would have preferred them to remain full-time working members of the royal family, we'd respect and understand their wish to live a more independent life as a family while remaining a valued part of my family. On January the 8th, the Sussexes had announced they intended to step back as senior members of the royal family, to work to become financially independent, choosing to make a transition this year and starting to carve out a progressive new role within this institution. At the time, they were living in Vancouver Island, Canada, before moving to California, where they eventually settled in Monty Shitshow, as we well know. Thus, Boris has got a book to sell, so it's been deemed appropriate to serialise it in the Daily Mail. Well, that's no great surprise. Many people do that. But we have this revelation that apparently he told Harry not to leave the UK and sought to persuade him. Now, is this something that Boris Johnson might have actually done? Well, naturally, as it serves his purpose, or if it did serve his purpose, he as a narcissist would, in the pursuit of the prime aims, may well view the departure of Harry and this one's wife as a blow to him, because he could see that there was a role for them. I actually think that Boris Johnson wouldn't have given two shits about this one's wife or Harry. He got more important things to focus on. He was enjoying waving his willy around in terms of the huge majority that he had just won, and would be focused on that. But naturally, in order to curry favour with the relevant officials and, of course, the royal family, namely the Queen and Prince Philip, it is understandable that he would have said, sure, I'll have a chat with him. After all, Boris is not somebody that would necessarily back down in the face of an opportunity for some self-promotion and, pursued by his own narcissism, the opportunity to curry favour with the royal family. However, whilst Boris plays up to this Boris the Bozo facade, which I've mentioned before is just part of his shtick as a narcissist, he actually is very, very acute in terms of the way that he always ensures that Boris comes out on top. Whatever he does, although he might come across as this bumbling bozo, Boris succeeds and gets what he essentially requires. He has led a charmed political life, as I've explained elsewhere, and he still has people that would prefer him to be Prime Minister. But putting that to one side, what about the suggestion that he sought to persuade Harry? Is this something that the royal family would have wanted? And here is where I think that there is some revision of history that is taking place. At this point, you've got to remember that Harry was very much under the grip of this one's wife. He had been persuaded by his wife that she and him were the victims, and that the most appropriate thing to do would be to go elsewhere and to carve out a path for themselves. This was because this one's wife's narcissism didn't fancy engaging in service, because that brings with it accountability and effort. And what she wants is for people to call her name and clap her and cheer her with the minimum of effort, i.e. a word salad speech, to be paid lots of money for doing very little, basically being paid because it's her, and living the life of a celebrity based upon actual no talent, although of course she believes that she has got talent. The point of all of that is that going and opening a biscuit factory in Runcorn on a Raisiny Tuesday isn't going to appeal to her, because that requires effort. It requires a high boredom threshold. It requires her to speak to the plebs, to the poors. She doesn't want to do that. She wants to be hobnobbing with celebrities and A-listers because she believes that that's her crowd. Accordingly, her narcissism looked at all of that and thought, no, don't fancy that. We need to get away from this. Also, of course, where she'd attempted to rule the roost and order people around and met with resistance, her narcissism also thought, well, in order to nullify those threats to control, we need to withdraw. And therefore, in order to achieve that successfully, she needed to persuade the intimate partner primary source, Harry, that he too needed to leave. Thus, her narcissism directed her to engage in a steady campaign of drip, drip, drip in relation to Harry, telling him, your friends aren't very nice, your family have got it in for me, I felt suicidal and nobody supported me. The men in suits are nasty, William looked at me funny. Catherine is always putting me down and she made me cry. We are the victims, Harry. We are the victims, Harry. We are the victims, Harry. We would be better off doing our own thing away from all of this, and you need to realise you've been trapped. And typical of the behaviour of the narcissist, she continued to pour this poison into his ear under the auspices of what was best for him, meaning that Harry, dimwit with high emotional thinking and completely in the grip of his wife's manipulations, had his head turned, and it wasn't for turning back the other way. Indeed, what he and she wanted was the best of both worlds, which was, we still want to have a connection to the royal family and be able to call upon it when we want, but we also want to go and be able to monetize it elsewhere and do what we want without having to kowtow to you lot. Naturally, the Queen said, not a chance, Ginge. You can fuck off. Or industrial language of an equivalent. Thus, at this point in time, having followed the Sandringham Summit, where it was rumoured that Prince Philip was so disgusted with Harry's response that he stormed out, the fact is, the royal family would have known full well that Harry was being intransigent about this issue, of course, as a consequence of his own stubbornness, but also exacerbated by his wife's behaviour. And therefore, there would be no point in trying to persuade Harry to stay. It would be a pointless exercise. And of course, Boris Johnson described it as hopeless because he recognised that also. What I think has gone on here is that there was clearly a chat that took place between the two. But I think Boris Johnson was both dispatched and, with his own view, being similar, to say to Harry, look, you're going, you need to really understand what that means. So you're labouring under no illusion as the fact you're now on the outside, pal. You need to understand that you're not going to get this taxpayer support with regard to your security. You're not going to get all the bells and whistles like you once did. I need to ensure that you understand all of this. Delivered, of course, probably with a few Latin quotes along the way, as was and is Boris's wont. I don't believe that Boris was dispatched to try and persuade him to stay. I believe that Boris and the royal family recognised that that was pointless, and in some respects, certain elements would be pleased to see the back of him, given the intransigence that he exhibited and the demands that he'd made in terms of how they wanted to play it. The audacity of Ginge and Whinge telling the royal family how they wanted it. And thus, I think what's happened is that typically Boris Johnson, wanting to be seen to play the hero in relation to his memoir, plays it as if, yes, I was dispatched to try and persuade them, but, it didn't work because Harry, very set in his ways. It doesn't sound as interesting to say, I was dispatched to tell Harry this is how it is, and basically to make him a member of the Pink Bottom Brigade for being a naughty boy and departing. That doesn't attract the headlines or interest. Instead, I think that there's been a revision of history, that Boris did indeed have a conversation with him, that he didn't seek to persuade him to stay because people realised that was entirely pointless at that juncture. Remember, this conversation took place a week after the Sandringham Summit, and instead, I think Boris Johnson was dispatched in order to tell Harold a few home truths so that he could be under no misunderstanding as the fact that he was now on the outside. And Boris would be quite content to convey that to him. Now, years later, Boris, with his usual self-serving nature, has a book to sell, and therefore it's rephrased as him trying to persuade Harry to stay, when actually that wasn't what happened. What are your thoughts on the matter? Either way, of course, Harry was demonstrating the way that a victim often behaves when in the grip of a narcissist and failing to understand and listen to what anybody else has to say. Do you think Boris did really try and persuade him to stay and he rejected it? Or do you agree with me that in essence Boris is engaging in a bit of a revision of history and was dispatched basically to issue some home truths to Harry? Do you think at that juncture the royal family decided, he's made his decision, he's one that's backed out, we've not kicked him out, he's resigned so he can go. He's not getting what he wants. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. I'm H.G. Judah. Thank you for listening.